This video will cover the material for Chapter 9, which is all about biomes. So a biome of the Earth is defined as an extensive region with a relatively uniform vegetation structure. And a vegetation structure is just a specific type of vegetation that dominates a region. So a biome is defined by the specific types of vegetation that tend to dominate most of that region. That is a climate biome. The type of biome is determined primarily by climate, and it makes sense that the type of climate in an area has a huge impact on the type of vegetation that can grow there, because that determines what the temperature is like, what the wind is like, and how much annual rainfall an area gets or not in the case of a desert. First, we'll talk about the low latitude biomes that occur relatively close to the equator, within about 25 degrees north and south of the equator. That's the low latitude biomes. So there are three types of low latitude biomes, and some things that they all have in common. They all have a relatively warm climate, which makes sense because they're constantly near the ITCZ and the subsolar point, so they're constantly in an area with relatively high heat and temperature from the sun. They all have either a wet climate all year in the case of the immediate area around the equator, like the rainforests, or they have a wet summer and a drier winter season in one or two of these biomes. And there's a wide variety of plant life. The rainforests tend to have an extreme amount of very unique, very large tree species, whereas the savannas are more like grasslands that don't have too much tree life, but they have other kinds of grass species there. So our first biome like this is the tropical rainforest, and as the name implies, it is very hot and very wet all year. Almost every single day, the tropical rainforest will get some amount of precipitation, and often a very heavy amount. The tropical rainforests also have the highest primary productivity, biomass, and biodiversity of any biome. So there are many hundreds of thousands, even millions of plant and animal species living in the tropical rainforest that we haven't even fully discovered or contacted yet. A lot of them are small insects or obscure plants that we don't know too much about yet. And it's because of the climate here that this area has such incredible biodiversity of both plant and animal species. The most famous tropical rainforest is, of course, the Amazon forest in South America, which is enormous, but there are also tropical rainforests in parts of Africa and Asia and Indonesia as well. Our second low latitude biome is the tropical seasonal forest, and really the two things that distinguish it from the tropical rainforest is that the tropical seasonal forest has a relatively dry winter. So it still gets an enormous amount of rain and it's still very hot, but unlike the tropical rainforest, which is wet year-round, the seasonal forest does have a relatively dry winter where it gets less precipitation and it's a little bit less hot on average. These tropical seasonal forests are generally found in low elevation bordering a tropical rainforest. So immediately bordering places like the Amazon rainforest, you'll have this transition zone of tropical seasonal forests, which are still very hot and wet and still have a lot of biodiversity, but aren't quite at the threshold of a true tropical rainforest because there is a little bit of more seasonality with the climate pattern there. Pretty much the entire countries of Cuba and Vietnam, for example, are in this tropical seasonal forest biome. So they're very hot, they get an enormous amount of rain, as many as 300 centimeters of annual rainfall, which is a huge amount. So that puts into perspective how much rain the actual tropical rainforests get if even 300 centimeters of rainfall isn't quite enough to be considered a true rainforest. And our third low latitude biome is called the tropical savanna. This biome is centered at or around 25 degrees north and south in both hemispheres. Now, this biome actually doesn't exist at all in the United States, but there's a lot of tropical savanna, especially in Africa. About half the continent is this biome. Nearly the entire country of India is this biome. So this covers a big chunk of the Earth's surface. The tropical savanna is primarily a woodland biome with a few widely spaced trees and a continuous cover of tall grass. If you watch any Animal Planet documentaries, especially in Africa, of species like lions and zebras, that probably is taking place in this tropical savanna environment, which has just continuous grass cover, a very small amount of special trees that can survive in this type of environment. So relative to the other two low latitude biomes, the tropical savanna has much lower biomass and biodiversity. It has wet summers and especially dry winters compared to the other two. And to help you guys visualize where these low latitude biomes are found, there's a very helpful map and graph on page 271 of your textbook for the tropical rainforest, on page 276 of your textbook for the tropical seasonal forest, and on page 277 of the textbook for the tropical savanna. So familiarize yourselves with those graphs from your textbook if you have it, because on the exam we might ask you to identify that particular type of biome based on its climate graph that shows its annual precipitation and its monthly temperature range. Now we've covered the low latitude biomes, we'll talk about the 5 biomes that are found in the mid-latitude and high latitude zones. And one thing to keep in mind with all 5 of these biome types is that if we're talking about a place that's far from the ocean in these biomes, it's going to have a large annual temperature range and a much smaller annual temperature range near the coast, because of that effect we talked about in the first and second units that being on the coast has towards climate because of the special properties of water. A place that's near the coast is going to have a much more moderate, temperate climate compared to a place that's in the middle of an interior of a continent like Kansas City, Missouri, for example. Our first mid-latitude biome is the temperate grassland, and as the name implies, this biome is dominated by various types of grass, a much smaller amount of trees, almost entirely grass. And these are found mostly between 30 and 60 degrees, the mid-latitude zones, in continental interiors. So when you think of the Midwest and the Great Plains part of our country, that's what this biome is. And there's also a huge temperate grassland in Central Asia called the steppe. That is also this type of biome. It's just another name for it. Now these areas with temperate grasslands tend to have a moisture deficit for most of the year. They don't get enough precipitation to really form many trees year-round, which is why these areas are dominated by grass instead. There are good maps of the temperate grassland biome on pages 280 and 281 of your textbook. Our second mid-latitude biome is the Mediterranean biome, which is the rarest of all the biomes on Earth. This occurs in places with hot, dry summers and relatively cool, rainy winters. There are 3 main factors that control the vegetation structure in the Mediterranean biome. First, there tends to be an extended summer drought where there isn't much rain, so the plants that exist in these biomes tend to be drought resistant. They can survive for a long time with minimal precipitation. Second, there are very frequent wildfires in this biome. So again, the plants here have evolved over thousands of years to be more fire resistant than your average plant in other biomes. And that's what's allowed them to survive even as wildfires are very frequent in the Mediterranean biome. In fact, it's not a coincidence that Australia had a significant wildfire just a few months ago, and California deals with wildfires every year because a significant part of both of those places are this Mediterranean biome. And what makes them so vulnerable to fires is that the vegetation there is very small, kind of dry grass and shrubs, which is basically perfect kindling for a fire to spread itself very easily and quickly. It's just the perfect burn material for a fire. So these areas are some of the most vulnerable to wildfires of any on Earth. And lastly, this Mediterranean biome has very low soil nutrients and soil organic matter. It's very tough to grow things in this biome. Only very specific types of crops can grow here, like olives and most famously wine. If you can grow the reddish purple grapes for wine in this area, it's probably part of this Mediterranean biome. So it makes sense that California produces by far the most wine of any American state, because a lot of California is this biome. California is the only state in the country that is part of this biome. It's why Australia produces lots of wine. And of course, it's why Italy, Spain, and Greece produce lots of wine, because they are in this biome as well. It's called the Mediterranean biome because most of the Mediterranean regions around the Mediterranean Sea in Europe and Africa are this biome. There's a good map and diagram of the Mediterranean biome on page 283 of your textbook. So our third mid-latitude biome is one that will be very familiar to many of you who are from the United States, especially the eastern part of the United States. It's the temperate deciduous forest. This biome occurs in mid-latitude zones where the annual temperature range is very large and where winters tend to have below freezing temperatures, which causes the trees there to have a very specific reaction as they shed their leaves in response to the freezing, hence the name deciduous. So nearly the entire eastern United States, nearly all of mainland Europe, and a big chunk of China are all in this temperate deciduous forest biome, where the trees annually lose their leaves through the process called abscission. That's when they start turning all these beautiful colors, and eventually they fall off and the cycle begins anew the next spring when new leaves are formed. That's what determines a temperate deciduous forest. And where we are in South Louisiana is a very interesting place because we're kind of right where the temperate grassland biome meets the temperate deciduous forest biome that most of our part of the United States is. So we're kind of right in the middle of a transition zone in South Louisiana between two biomes. There aren't many places in the U.S. that are like that between those two particular biomes. And this biome is almost exclusively found in the northern hemisphere. There aren't too many places in the southern hemisphere that are like that, just because of the temperature dynamics and the dynamics of the land size in the northern hemisphere compared to the southern hemisphere. And there are good maps and graphs of this biome on page 284 of your textbook in chapter 9. Our fourth mid-latitude biome is called the temperate rainforest, not to be confused with the tropical rainforest. It's a very important distinction. In a temperate rainforest, the annual precipitation is high, so it gets a lot of rainfall, but the temperatures are mild. It doesn't freeze very much, nor does it get too hot. The climate is very temperate. The temperatures stay within a very mild range. And these temperate rainforests are often found on the west coasts of continents because of the global pressure belt dynamics there that have an effect on climate. This biome is the Patagonia region of South America, and more famously the Cascadia region in the northwest part of our country in British Columbia and Canada, so roughly from Vancouver all the way down to Portland. And also the famous redwood trees in California that grow really, really tall and are very old are also part of this temperate rainforest biome. And it's the enormous amount of precipitation that enables the trees like the redwoods and the evergreens to grow so tall, because they're getting enough moisture to support that type of growth. So in a temperate rainforest, you have very large trees that form a dense canopy. There's more information on this biome with some maps on pages 286 and 287 of your textbook. And finally, we have our fifth high latitude biome. We group it with the mid latitudes. This is called the boreal forest. This is among the largest biomes on Earth, even though it's a biome which very few people or animal species live. It makes up a tremendous amount of both North America and the Eurasian continent. This biome constitutes nearly the entire country of Russia, as well as a big part of Canada as well. So again, this is a cold coniferous forest, so trees that have pine cones. It's adapted to a very cold environment that frequently has freezing temperatures. It's found only in continental interiors, which makes sense because along the coasts, the climate is much more temperate and it doesn't get quite cold enough for there to be these type of trees. But in the continental interior, it does get cold enough, especially at the high latitudes, 60 degrees north and south and above. It's very common to find this boreal forest biome. So there are very low winter temperatures here, often below freezing, and a very short growing season in the summer that might only last a couple months. And you can only grow a very limited number of crops. So even with modern technology, only a very small amount of people actually live in this biome. It's just too cold. It's too difficult to grow crops. So only a very small number of mostly indigenous people, both in Russia and in Canada, have ever really lived in this biome. You won't find really any modern settlements here, except for a very few exceptions. And to close out this chapter, lastly, we have 3 biomes that are not limited so much by altitude. They can grow at any altitude. They're more determined by altitude and the elevation from the Earth's surface, but they can occur really at any latitude where the conditions are right. So our first biome like this is called a montane forest. And basically all this is, we talked about how mountains have that orographic lifting effect. One side tends to get almost all of the rainfall, and the other side of the mountain tends to be a rain shadow desert, while on the side where the mountain does cause there to be rain, we'll often see this montane forest because so much precipitation gets dropped and it's very cold, it'll form a specific type of forest in these areas called a montane forest. Montane simply referring to the word mountain in Latin. And there's a map of the montane forest biome on page 289 of your textbook. Our second type of biome that can occur at any latitude, but primarily it occurs at the high latitudes, is the tundra biome. And this simply occurs at any latitude where it is too cold for trees to grow. So either at the very, very high latitudes or also up in the mountains past a certain elevation point called the tree line, where it becomes too cold for even the hardiest trees to survive past that point. Then we have the tundra biome. So this tundra area is both extremely cold and it gets very little precipitation. Not quite enough to be a desert, but very close. So no trees grow in this biome, only very limited amount of species of certain types of grass and maybe certain types of flowers can grow here, but it's mostly a very barren environment. And again, almost no human beings can live here because it's simply too impossible to grow crops here. There's very little plant or animal life here. And there's 2 types of tundra, which we talked about. The alpine tundra, which occur because of high altitude up in the mountains. So you have a mountain range, and past a certain point, trees may no longer be able to grow. So the biggest region of the world with this alpine tundra is the Himalayas. And we also have the second type, simply called the northern tundra, which occurs only in the northern hemisphere. And this is the parts of Canada and Russia where the latitude is so high, it's simply too cold for anything to grow. And a good map of the tundra biome is found on page 291 of your textbook. And this brings us to the final note you'll need to know for your exam, which is about desert. And a desert is simply any area with a chronic moisture deficit. So we're talking about an area that gets 6 inches of precipitation, 10 centimeters or less over the course of a year. So very, very small amount of precipitation. Only very special drought-adapted plants and animals can live in a desert environment. So desert covers nearly 30% of the Earth's land surface, and desert is found on every single continent. The single largest desert in the world is the Sahara Desert, found in northern Africa, but there are many others as well. And most people, when they picture a desert, tend to think of a hot, sandy one like the Sahara or the Arabian Desert. But remember, a desert is simply defined as an area with a chronic moisture deficit. It doesn't necessarily have to be a hot, sandy desert. There are also cold deserts found in polar regions. So the entire continent of Antarctica is considered a desert. It's just a cold desert rather than a hot one. And the area in the Arctic is also a cold desert. So we just talked about cold deserts, but there are also hot deserts found in places like northern Africa, the Arabian Peninsula, and also the outback of Australia, where temperatures are very, very high in addition to the minimal rainfall. So it's very tough for anything to survive here. In our country, the Sonora Desert and the Mojave Desert in the southwestern part of our country are hot deserts. And our third and final type of desert is called a rain shadow desert. So we talked about the orographic lifting effect as mountains force rain on one side of the mountain. The other side of the mountain will often be called a rain shadow desert if it gets a very small amount of precipitation, enough to meet that desert threshold. Probably the most prominent example of a rain shadow desert is the Gobi Desert in Central Asia, especially in the country of Mongolia. And it's a rain shadow desert because the Himalayas mainly and a couple other smaller mountain ranges prevent that area of Central Asia from getting hardly any rain. So it becomes a rain shadow desert. There's some good maps and graphs about the desert biome found on pages 294 and 295 of your textbook. And that wraps up all of your material for Chapter 9 and all of your material for your exam. So good luck to everyone. Feel free to email me or Dr. Trepanier if you have any questions about the material, and I'll be happy to answer them. Good luck.